Glen Burrows, one half of Ethical Butcher. Thank you for joining us on the
Very welcome.
podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We've known each other for quite a few years now.
We have, indeed.
What I don't know, about 6 or 7, I guess? 5, 6, 7?
Yeah, that's
So
probably
you
about
were,
right.
for listeners' reference, you're a photographer,
Yeah,
first and foremost, and filmmaker. And in my apprenticeship, shall we call it, you're one of the guys that I used to assist.
yeah.
So so we've had a good relationship for quite a long time. So wanted to bring you on the podcast because, as has been the way with the podcast, always been our intention, when we want to learn something, we go to the experts and learn from them. And obviously the meat versus vegan has been a big topic, and that's not the intention of this podcast, for it to be a meat versus vegan, but to have an open conversation.
Yeah.
Where I currently find myself is that I eat meat.
Yeah.
And I know that my body feels better for it because I've tested it, essentially. When I eat vegetarian and vegan, I drop weight dramatically, and as soon as I go back to eating meat, I instantly feel better. But I'm also at a stage where I want to, whatever I put in my body, I want to be the best.
Yeah, do it in a conscious way, minimizing impact.
Can I just bridge a gap for
Sure.
people that are listening?
Mm-hmm.
You were introduced as a photographer, which is how it started, and also the founder of Ethical Butcher.
Yeah.
For some people listening going,
How
if
does
we
that work?
speak to
Yeah, so-
experts, why are we speaking to a photographer
So-
who started Ethical Butcher?
Okay,
So could you bridge
maybe
that
I'll
gap?
get better sort of fill in the background.
Yeah, go for
So
it.
I did a degree in food science, and it came through a love of food, and I didn't quite want to be a chef. I didn't quite want to do this kind of 70-hour weeks in the kitchen getting shouted at, but I still wanted to work within that industry. And in the first year of my degree, which was 1989, one of the things we were studying was the potential time bomb of the BSE crisis at the time. And that came from an abhorrent practice called mechanically reclaimed protein. So I knew nothing of the meat production, industrial meat production, until I got into my degree. I was an omnivore, and learning about this process. So an abattoir would collect all of the bones from the kills, and back then abattoirs killed cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, goats. Everything would be done in one place. All of the remaining bones at the end were put into a machine that was basically a series of spinning brushes. It would break apart all of the last bits and produce a product called mechanically reclaimed protein. And this contained spinal columns and bits of brain, and any last scrap of recoverable protein from the remains of the carcass was then processed into animal feed. And this process was causing diseases to cross over. So BSE, for those that don't know, bovine spongiform encephalitis, I think it is, otherwise known as mad cow disease, came from a disease in sheep called scrapie. And there is a human version called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. And the prediction was that the disease had jumped from sheep because of this process to cows. And just think about this: a cow is a grazing herbivore, as is a sheep. And pigs and chickens are omnivores, but the other two are grazing herbivores. They were being fed a high protein feed made of ground up other cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens. And it made them fat quickly, and it brought them to market faster. But when I learned about, and diseases were crossing over, and that the danger was, or the fear was, that this disease would be, if in cows, would spread to humans. And there was a prediction of a time bomb, essentially, where they had no idea the effect it would have, but that this disease might end up in the human food chain and start giving people CJD, which is a horrific. It's a disease where holes appear in your brain, irreversible, terminal. Not a nice way to go. And so that kind of put me off not only eating meat, but it put me off the whole industry. Because I thought, so I became vegetarian in the first year of my degree. And just purely, I always maintained throughout that period, I don't object to humans eating meat. I massively object to the way that we're producing our meat. And that kind of put me off working in the industry. Back then, being a vegetarian was kind of weird. It was, it was a very different time.
It's like early
This is
90s.
yeah, right.
Well, 89, yeah. I mean, it really was a different time. And I didn't really see a place for myself within the industry. So kind of followed my hobby of photography into a career. And I think because of that interest in health and in nutrition and food, I kind of always, even within photography, I kind of gravitated towards working within sport and health and fitness. And I did a lot of work for the health and fitness magazines, and I maintained my vegetarianism for 25 years.
Wow.
So that kind of helps bridge the gap. But how I came to be going from vegetarianism to co-founding an online butcher is that I've got 2 kids, and when my second was born, my wife was also vegetarian and suffered from adrenal fatigue, and she was really, really quite sick. It gets referred to as burnout, and it's one of our classic modern lifestyle-based diseases. And through a long process of seeing a lot of different therapists and naturopaths and nutritionists, was put on a sort of elimination diet from an already restrictive diet, and ended up with nothing to eat. And eventually a naturopath who we were seeing at the Hale Clinic said, I think you should introduce some good quality meat back into your diet and see how you feel. I know you have principles, I know you're a vegetarian, but just try it. And I think it made me realize at the time, I was, I quite objected to this. Neither of us had eaten meat for a really long time. We ate a little bit of fish sometimes, but we'd formed a strong belief system around our identity as vegetarians. All of our friends knew us as the vegetarians. Our family knew us as the vegetarians. It was a very hard thing to give up. It was like giving up a religion, saying, well, I don't believe in this anymore. And there was fear of ridicule. There was also fear of, from a personal level, have I got it wrong? But anyway, she tried. She changed her diet and cut out the grains, the refined sugars, massively reduced the carbs, started eating meat again, and within 2 weeks her health blossomed, and that's the best way of describing it. She went from being quite metabolically broken to just having a new lease of life. Wow. And was suddenly signing up to do boot camp classes in the park, whereas previously she was sleeping 14 hours a day. I mean, just absolutely revitalized. And it was shifting macros, it was a combination of things. It was iron, it was absorbable protein, it was more switching energy systems into less carb, it was less spiking, less inflammation, less spiking adrenals, etc., etc. But I kind of saw this happen and then had to reconsider everything I thought I believed in. So at that point, kind of got into the books, as it were, and read pretty much all of I saw this paleo diet, as it was called. The whole concept was new to me then, but read everything I could about why it works, looked into the science of it, and decided, it's worked there. I didn't think that I was particularly suffering in any way from my diet, but decided to try it, and then realized that I really was not as well as I should have been because of the difference. Wow. And again, it gave me, a new lease on life. And now I know enough to know that what it did was just reduce inflammation. So all of the things I was suffering from at the time that I didn't even know were suffering, things like brain fog, and I started to develop psoriasis, and I just thought, I'm getting older and these things happen, and a bit of joint pain. I was skinny but a bit chubby. I wasn't, I didn't have a lot of muscle mass. I was active but not really performing at a particularly high level, and putting some high quality animal products into my diet just changed everything. It was like waking up again. It was a bit of an epiphany, and I didn't care the fact that, you had the sniggering friends and going, I knew you'd come round to bacon and all that kind of bullshit that you get. I didn't care. I felt so different, so better. I didn't mind. I took it on the chin. Yeah, you're right. Whatever. Shut up. Yeah. So that was what led me back to being an omnivore, and still continuing my job as a photographer and filmmaker. And then I met my co-founder, Farshad. I was simply introduced to him by a mutual friend. He was and still is a meat trader. So he was buying meat from the market and selling it to restaurants, acting as a middleman. And he wanted to crowdfund to expand his business. He simply needed a filmmaking for crowdfunding. I was introduced to him, and everything sort of flowed from there. When I was talking to him, I kind of saw the new business as an opportunity to get for the business to become what I wanted it to be, which was quite hard to find, which is somewhere where I didn't have to worry about the provenance of what I was buying. That all that due diligence had been done. And there were very few places that could do that. There was a couple of websites I used to buy meat from, but I found that the quality was variable because there was no central point. It was coming in from different farms and you didn't quite know what you were getting. So I talked a lot with Farshad about the aims of his new business, and he was initially just very focused on quality. And when we started pulling out what does quality mean, we found that it was very wrapped in ethics. You know, you can't separate the two. And eventually I persuaded him to focus on the ethics first and let the quality follow. We did a bit of experimentation. We kind of talked to some people, and I think that the important starting point for the business was discovering an organization called the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. And the reason that that exists is there's a loophole in DEFRA's food labeling that allows meat to be labeled as grass-fed if the animal's diet was, in quotes, predominantly grass. So you can have a cow, a steer for eating that's been gone through its life cycle of being grass reared and grain finished. And by grain, I literally do mean GMO soy flown in from America. As long as that's only forms 49% of its diet, that meat can be sold as grass fed. And something we'll get into later probably is the difference between grass fed and grain fed. It's a different product. It's a different product for us, for the animal, and massively different is the environmental impact. And the shift is literally between positive and negative. So we discovered this organization, Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, that guarantees the entire animal's diet has been grass or pasture. Grass, pasture, and they're allowed silage in the winter. No hormones, no antibiotics. And we sort of started delving deeper and deeper and deeper into that, and decided that should form, for grazing animals anyway, that should form the basis of our business. And we came up with the idea of the ethical butcher. It was sort of a working title that kind of over time developed a bit of a life of its own and stuck.
I was going to say, what are the ethics?
So
where do you...
They have kind of evolved a little bit. So I would say that the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association is our base level. It's almost our minimum standard. So because you can be feeding a cow or sheep, you can be feeding them only pasture and grass without having a positive impact on the environment. You can do that in a way that you would consider to be sustainable. So when we started delving deeper into what some of the farmers were doing, we discovered a process called holistic management. And holistic management is one of the techniques that can come under a larger umbrella that can be considered regenerative agriculture. And regenerative agriculture is exactly what it sounds. You are actually regenerating land. You're having not just a neutral impact, which would be sustainable, you're having a positive impact. So you're using animals as part of a chain to actively improve a current system. So when we discovered that, oh my God, you can actually produce food for humans in a way that has a positive impact. And within that idea of a positive impact, in the right cases, it's carbon negative. So you're creating so much extra plant growth by the use of the animals compared to that plant growth that could happen without the animals, that you're sequestering more carbon than the animals are producing. You have a net loss of carbon while producing food for humans. And with the current quite rightful worry about the levels of CO2 in the air, that was a light bulb moment of like, well, how can we source all of our meat like this? Or can we source the vast majority of meat like this? Does it just apply to cows and sheep? Can you apply this to chickens, goats, pigs? How deep does this go? What is it all about? And in some ways we're still learning, and in some ways we're still having these conversations with producers and trying to persuade people to go through different methods. But the aim of our business is to push and source as much from regenerative agriculture as possible.
What's the process of what's the farming process with the animals that makes it takes more carbon out of the environment than
conventional farming? So I think one of the forms of regenerative agriculture is called holistic management or holistic planned grazing. There's a few different terms for it, But it was essentially invented by a Zimbabwean a naturalist called Alan Savory. And he developed the technique through observations in Africa and how animals made a ecosystem less brittle, and you could return desert back into grassland by the use of animals grazing the land. And the basic premise of it is, let's say you can imagine this table is a 70-acre field and you've got 50 cows in it, and you put all the cows in the field and they just spread out across the whole field and they'll slowly eat the grass. Well, eventually that system will start to decline as a productive system. If you take this 70-acre field and you split it into 71-acre patches and you herd the cows into a single 1-acre field, so they're tightly bunched together, they're going into this pasture when it's really high. So they haven't been on this particular bit of land for 60 days, 70 days, whatever it is. So when they come in, the pasture's up to here. It's diverse. We've heard numbers in the hundreds of different species of plants in this particular bit of land. They will eat the choicest bits of the plant. They'll urinate, defecate. They stamp the seeds in. They pull at the plants. Their saliva has an enzyme that's having an effect of making the plants grow more.
So they're tending the soil.
Yeah, and then you move them.
Right.
So you move them the next day. So they've had quite an intense but short-acting effect on the land. And what you're essentially doing is you're mimicking the movement that they would have had across the Great Plains of America when they would have moved in a huge herd, and they would have naturally been tighter together because they were worried about predators. Yeah. So safety in numbers, they would have had a tight pack, they would have had an intense effect on the land and then moved frequently. What happens is as soon as they move, you get this growth spurt. So carbon is taken from the air, it's pumped into the soil, the roots grow, the plants grow, and many other incredible things happen, like the cows learn which plants to eat to self-medicate, and all this sort of thing happens. But you're creating, you're effectively taking carbon out of the air and putting it into the soil. There's a whole bunch of complex processes involving methane-loving bacteria and just this kind of growth of life. But with this very diverse pasture, you have a massive knock-on effect. So when you've got a greater variety of plants, you have a greater variety of pollinating insects. You have a greater variety of birds that eat those pollinating insects, and all the way up to these trophic levels of the ecosystem. And the more complex an ecosystem, the less brittle it is the term they use. The less, so, for example, soil that's got more carbon in can hold more water. Well, if you can hold more water, you're both more flood resistant and more drought resistant. So as, climate fluctuates, this system is much more able to cope. But there's been a few places where measurements have been done, accurate enough to prove that that these farms are operating with a carbon deficit. So they're pumping so much new carbon. Animals produce carbon dioxide and methane. The rumen ferments. Part of that process produces CO2 and methane. But when done correctly, you're taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than the animals are releasing.
Wow.
Two things I just read recently about the history of the Amazon and the soil in the Amazon, and that it's actually not a very nutrient dense soil to grow in.
No, it's quite thin, isn't it? Yeah.
But if you go back like 8 to 16,000 years, and you look at the civilizations that were living there, which has kind of just recently been proved, they speculate that it was a man-made soil called terra preta, also known as black earth.
A biochar, right? Yeah.
And the process with that was that animal remains, human feces were all kind of mixed together in the soil, and then it was burnt. And the charcoal that was produced as a result of that was then nutrient rich to then go back into the soil, which regenerated it to then grow. And the whole the areas that they found where there were mass civilizations, going up to recent figures are around 8 to 16 million people living in the Amazon at that time. That's what supported them, that soil. Yeah, and it's interesting because you tend to think of the Amazon as being this sort of very, rich kind of ecosystem. But as you said, the soil compared to the Great Plains of America, for example, and the place in the Great Plains of America where the topsoil is 12 feet deep, and it was one of the greatest carbon sinks on the planet. So you look at a forest where all of the carbon is above ground. Well,
carbon above ground, a tree's life cycle is maybe 100 years, and then that carbon's being released back. You put it into the soil, it can be locked in there for thousands and thousands of years. It's a much more reliable place that we should be putting our soil, putting the carbon into the soil rather than above the ground. So the more we can do to kind of put the carbon below ground than above, the better. But it's the plants living above the ground that are sort of pumping it down. And the Great Plains were a massive global carbon sink when there were 60 million bison running around.
We did a good job at wiping those out.
Yeah, well, we are, exactly, and we are actually. I'm a bit nervous about quoting figures here, but I know we're eating less beef than we were in the 70s, but there are more people, so I don't quite know how that equates to. I did read somewhere that there were when it was bison as opposed to industrial agriculture, there were as many, if not more, pounds of meat, if you want to put it that way, running around the Great Plains of America then than there are now, and yet no one was worried about global warming because it was providing a net loss.
It was managed.
Yeah.
We're restoring balance. That sounds like the farming
it's just
techniques.
Working with nature, not against it. And because we have to take within that system, if we're going to keep cattle this way, we're almost taking the place of the apex predator. And we should be doing that in a way that mimics nature as closely as possible.
Can we talk, can we just go back? You mentioned about the difference between grain and grass-fed.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so...
why is one better than the other, for example?
So there are three reasons. There's an environmental reason, there's an animal health reason, there's a human health reason. So grains, there is... When you're measuring carbon, when you're measuring the CO2, the effects of farming, grass-feeding cows does produce more methane. So purely pasture-fed cows are burping out more methane than a grain-fed cow. There are two reasons for this. First of all, this is a natural fermentation. This is how the cows digest cellulose. So if I understand this correctly, a cow isn't really eating the grass in a sense. A cow is using bacteria in its rumen to ferment the grass to produce short-chain fatty acids that fuel the cow. So the cow is almost in ketosis, if you like. It's not really using the sugar as a source. It's fermenting it. So when you feed a cow grains, it gets fat much quicker, because it's having a high starch,
lots of sugars.
Storing
fat, right.
But what happens is, for the cow, there's a transition phase where the stomach becomes very acidic. So the whole microbiome has to shift, and they can adapt, but they go through a phase that can be quite painful because the pH is shifting, it becomes a lot more acidic. They can get ulcers as a result of this. When they get ulcers, they require antibiotic treatment. The antibiotics also help them get fatter quicker, and this system does release less greenhouse gas. I mean, because the cows don't have to live as long to reach weight, which is another reason that in their life cycle they're putting out. But you're releasing a lot of greenhouse gas just to get that grain grown in a field, harvested, transported, processed, taken to the cow. So when you look at the entire bigger cycle of carbon, you're not winning, and you're not sequestering anything. You're not putting anything back into the ground, and you're not. All the processes that we talked about earlier of the cows, like eating the ground, trampling seeds, none of that is happening. They're just kept in. So the cow's rumen has to adjust to eating grains and go through this process. But as it grows, then the omega balance of the fats that you're producing in the cow shifts. One of the farmers who we're sourcing from, she was before she went into farming, she was a sports nutritional therapist. Right. And every year she sends a couple of her steaks off to a lab to have them tested for nutrition. And the lab results came back. Last time she sent a sirloin steak off, and the lab results came back, and they said to her, "This is astonishing. The fat profile of your beef is closer to wild salmon than it is to conventionally reared beef." Wow. So it's super high. 100% pastured beef is really high in omega-3. Omega-3 is heart protective to us. It's anti-cancer. It's also got high levels of CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, which is a sports supplement a lot of people take. It helps you metabolize fat. It's also higher in all the fat-soluble vitamins. When you feed the cow grains, the CLA plummets, and the fat balance shifts to being much heavier to the omega-6 side of things. Well, too much omega-6 is inflammatory. In really overly simplistic terms, it's like the difference between vegetable oil and fish oil. So that from to us, that's the difference between the fat profile of the meat. So I would say to people,
and by vegetable oil, you mean canola and
seed oils. Yeah. I'm not talking the good vegetable oils. I'm talking the bad ones. It's it's a bit extremist to look at it like that, but there is some truth in it. So if you are going to eat meat and you doubt the provenance, go for the leanest cut you can. If you know the provenance is good, go for the fattiest, most rich, nutritious cuts you can.
There are so many paradigm shifts that we as culture then have to get our head around.
Yeah.
Fats, meat.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see where people become up in arms about all of this, plant-based or meat eating or fats, sugars. You're like, God, it's quickly becomes a whole mess. It kind of quickly mimics the mess that's caused by grinding up all the leftovers and feeding it.
I mean, we're learning really slowly.
Yeah.
How does this then relate to? We've talked about beef.
Yeah.
How does that relate to, say, chicken, for example? Because do you know? As just a random question is in my head, like the consumption of chickens, cows and pigs. Like what's the a chicken's the most consumed, and then
I actually don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I would take a guess that chicken is the most consumed meat in England, but I actually don't know the figures for that. The one thing I can tell you is interestingly, the cows and the sheep have been the easiest to source ethically because it's really obvious what we need to do. We can go to the Pasture Fed Livestock Association. We look at their farms. There's about 80 farms. That's our base level. We look for the guys who are doing extraordinary things within that group. The guys who are doing regenerative techniques beyond just 100% pasture feeding, easy to find. Chickens, we have had a real difficult time because the chickens that we eat now, which are considered commercial breeds, even if they're considered rare breeds, are quite dependent on soy as a protein source for coming to weight, if you like. They don't, and from, I'm by no means an expert, I'm not a farmer, but a real bugbear of mine is I'm not going to say, well, all of the beef that we serve is grain-free and soy-free, but chickens need it, so therefore we're going to sell chicken. So I've managed to persuade a chicken farmer to reformulate the chicken feed to be soy-free and for all of the ingredients to have been sourced from the UK, and we're working on having those grains to become organic. So a chicken is a natural omnivore. So for a chicken to be very healthy, it should be eating bugs, worms, berries, a bit of herbs, all kinds of stuff. They'll eat all kinds of stuff. But obviously, the same as I believe for us, the optimal diet is a balanced omnivorous one. It's the same with the chicken. There is a really difficult period in chicken's life where it has a higher protein requirement, and it's usually in the kind of early years like it would be with us. Anyway, it's going to be next summer before we get the first batch of these soy-free chicken through. They'll have lived for 90 to 100 days, which is about 3.5 times longer than a conventional chicken. They're going to be expensive, and we make no apologies for that, but we want to see this to be the beginning of a movement.
Chicken used to be expensive. I always remember my parents saying, chicken would be a treat.
Yeah.
And how it's shifted. And you go into a supermarket now, and I find it quite sad actually when they're like
the
chickens,
price,
and you're like, oh my God, that's like, how can you do that for that price?
Yeah. Well, it's because
it's being churned out. Yeah. But like everything, we've had conversations on sustainability and clothing, and it's the same. The process has been mechanized so efficiently that we only see the end result. It's like people just want the meat or the garment and forget where it's come from and the process
and the impact it's
had.
had. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of put at the moment I buy the best chicken I can, and when I have it, and I'm paying about £20 for a 2 kilo chicken. I think these soy-free chickens, which are even slower grown and probably will have a lower weight, are probably going to be closer to 25 or 30 pounds for a 2 kilo chicken. But you know, it should have a bit more reverence to it. You cook a roast on Sunday, you maybe eat a little bit less meat and more vegetables. You then use the rest of it throughout the week, and when you've plucked off as much as you think you can, boil the carcass for 4 hours, make a broth, get the remaining nutrition out of the bones and the cartilage, and use every last gram of nutrition out of the animal.
Honor the animal first.
Honor the animal.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like you're touching on another big section there, which is actually connecting with what you're putting in your body.
Yeah.
Connecting with what it is.
Eat the liver, eat the heart, and you know, don't, you know, I think all of that should be supplied with your oven ready chicken. The gizzard, the lot should be used in whatever way.
Like the liver, because we had a conversation about liver earlier, and then obviously talking about my dog who had diabetes, sent me in a real track of, you know, how and why, and the idea of fatty liver caused by high carb diets, sugars, too many grains.
Yeah.
If you're feeding chickens all grain, you get a fatty liver, so you wouldn't want to eat those
necessarily,
things.
because chicken is when chickens again have been eating a diet too rich in grains, the omega balance is different, and
so you end up eating toxicity. I mean,
you are what you eat, and you are what your food ate as well. You know, that's another.
And how we don't connect those.
Yeah.
And it's easy to see it as, oh, it's a chicken, it's killed. Whereas there's a whole process of, you know, humans return to the soil, which then grows. I mean, you could go very spiritual on the whole cycle of it.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I think it's a really good point. I don't know how to continue talking about it, but being conscious of what you're consuming and being, you know, exactly what you're saying. It's like, you know, when you start to have a relationship with the food that you're putting into your body, you understand that this was a being, and that being had a life, and that the life is no longer there, and that you're consuming it, and therefore you have more respect. Like you said, every part of the, you know, you don't eat half the chicken and then throw half the chicken away. Like you understand that, you know, something's being killed, and that.
Well, you should. Should. This is, you know, and I, you know, it might sound a bit kind of elitist, and coming from a sort of very, you know, middle class privileged position to say you should pay more for it, but you should. I mean, we should be paying more for better quality food. And we will, if we pay more if you pay £30 for a chicken, you bloody damn right are not going to throw any of it away. You're going to work
mindlessly eating chicken 3 times a day.
True.
Because there's more of a reality of what you're actually.
Smaller amounts, you know, supplemented with a larger amount of vegetables.
Even taking it to indigenous people, you know, I mean, it's the famous story of the Native Americans on the Great Plains. They would kill a buffalo, and every single part of the animal was used. Yeah. You know, not just eaten, but, you know, it was used in. Exactly.
Worn,
it was worn, it was used for tools, etc., etc. It was like there was a great reverence and respect for what they were actually doing.
And the interesting sort of link into that as well, you were mentioning offal earlier, is that they prized the liver beyond the muscle meats, and we've lost our taste for the most nutritious parts of the animals. But from what little I know about that culture, they would have prized that the chief gets the liver, and when you go down to the cuts that we prize now, the lean, less fatty cuts, that was for the dog. So you know,
there was also, I think, you know, if we're going to talk about that culture or those cultures, rituals and beliefs around what was happening, like they weren't just mindlessly killed and then consumed. You know, there was, you know, they were honoured. Mm-hmm. There was a ritual. They understood that it was, you know, in their view, it wasn't just
cyclical as well.
There was a spirit to it, and so the spirit was honoured. You know, the spirit gave its body to the people, and there were rituals required in order for the spirit to come back. It was like there was a much bigger connection and process to it than just being like, oh, I'll buy a chicken for £3 down at Tesco's. Tesco's have squeezed the supplier to get it as cheap as possible, and then, you know,
so the supplier's feeding them suboptimal food.
But another point within, you know, while we're talking about chicken, is that again, looking at the effect that the animals have on the bigger environment, is that chickens go very well with grazing animals because they're a natural pest control. So there's a guy called Joel Salatin, I think, in America, who has developed this kind of rotational system. So we mentioned about the rotational grazing earlier. Well, if after the cows have been in this particular bit, you can run chickens through it, then the chickens will eat a lot of the potential parasites and bugs and things like that. They have another positive effect on the land. And that's really what we're looking for, and we're hoping to delve into as much as we can of the business, is looking for animals that have not just been produced in a way that does the least harm, but does some good. And it's not, the knowledge is there. We're just not doing it. And a lot of farmers are scared to try because the life cycle is so much longer. The chickens are not living for 32 days; they're living for 100 days. But with that life, the inputs are much lower. So they're stepping outside of the of needing any, agribusiness or the farmer who I mentioned who sends her beef off for testing. I said, how often do you need a vet to attend to your animals? And she kind of thought about it for a minute and said, I don't think we've had a vet out in a year. And I said, so no injections, no nothing, no feed. And she said, sunlight and rainwater.
Wow.
And that's to us is a wonderful system.
Yeah. Have you connected with Zach Bush?
I know Zach Bush.
Yeah.
I'm kind of a big fan of the sort of unrelenting work he's doing around glyphosate and
soil health.
Soil health.
Talk about like glyphosate, antibiotics, all these different elements which get introduced into meat, but also agriculture.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about glyphosate without going down the route of basically kind of slagging meat substitutes, which I'm not sure if it's something we really want to. I really want to go down.
You can talk about glyphosate with regards to the environment. I mean, it's used, and what? So here's a better way to put it. What are the effects of it? You can't say that it's not you, but one can't say it's better to eat, glyphosate and pesticide type product on one hand at the expense of eating healthy food on the other hand, and that could be meat versus veg or veg versus meat,
sure. I mean, I don't know. it was a while ago when I read Zach Bush's book, but there was from what I understand, it's a genetic disruptor and it has quite a negative effect on your gut microbiome, even in parts per billion range. And for that reason, glyphosate is used. It does tie back into animal feed quite nicely because most soybeans grown in the world are GMO, and the reason that they're GMO is they have been bred to be resistant to glyphosate. So any non-organic soy you can pretty much guarantee contains glyphosate. What happens with these?
Did you know glyphosate was used in the Vietnam War?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And in fact,
to kill all the forests that the Viet Cong were living in quickly.
I think there's 11 patents on glyphosate, and herbicide is not one of them. Bizarrely,
yeah, it got put through as like an antibiotic, or there was something that
weird,
allowed it to move through.
Something very strange. But of all the patents, herbicide isn't one of them. But it's put onto pretty much all non-organic wheat as a desiccant before harvest. So
to kill it,
but because then it dries quicker. So when it dies quickly and then dries. So if you're you're grain harvesting and you've got a couple of days of sunshine, your wheat's not quite right, spray the whole thing with glyphosate. It dries out quickly. Your harvest is better. But it's
so wheat impacts on pasta, cereals, bread, cakes, everything that.
And
most people
animal feed,
of
course, so that's ending up in the system. So another reason for the grain versus grass is glyphosate, because I wish I knew the figures for this off the top of my head, but even organic, when you buy an organic chicken, there is a certain percentage of the feed that is allowed to be non-organic for you to label it as organic. It's kind of there's a lot of loopholes within food labeling. Free range, the term free range is virtually meaningless. It means the door's open, but the reality is
So correct me if I'm wrong here. So if you choose to be vegan, then eat organic, non-glyphosate,
100%
type product.
100%.
And if you choose to eat meat, then make sure you're eating grass-fed meat. So therefore, it doesn't have glyphosate grain being fed to it.
And this is kind of one of my big bugbears about a lot of the meat replacement things, particularly the ones that mimic meat, like the Impossible Burger, is that they're made from GMO soy. It's the primary ingredient in these things. So it's just not good for you. It's not good for you.
Anything that's been messed with isn't good for you.
It's a highly processed food. Yeah, absolutely.
Like anything.
Yeah.
I think also it's important to talk about that there's no one diet for all.
No, absolutely.
We're all unique. So everyone has a unique requirement.
Yeah. And a lot of it is linked to genetics, epigenetics, and our gut microbiome. I think they're the biggest dictators of what diet we thrive on. Yeah. And you've had the experience, I've had the experience of eating in different ways, and I'm sure James has as well, of like seeing what works and what doesn't. And the thing that we talked a lot before we started this was about developing an awareness of how foods make you feel. And I can honestly say that until I went back to being an omnivore, I didn't know what true satiety felt like. And I can still remember. So I dealt when I was getting back into eating meat. I must admit, the first time I ate red meat, I'd had most of a bottle of red wine for Dutch courage, and barbecued this meat and ate it, and was slightly kind of just. It triggered some really old memories of 25 years ago when I used to remember what meat tasted like. But I can't say there was any great revelation. But in the colder light of day, a couple of days later, when I thought, well, I'm going into this fully. I'm not just going to mess around with a little bit of chicken. So I bought some organic pastured lamb's liver, cooked it, and everyone in the family was freaking out. Oh, disgusting. And I still remember sitting down and eating it, and on my own, without the bottle of wine this time, and found myself vibrating. It's the only way I can describe it. I was sitting there. I had a very real, almost drug-like experience of, quite hard to describe, but intense cellular gratitude is the only way I can describe it. I was physically vibrating in a way that I've experienced from intense Bikram classes and things like that. Like energetically vibrating.
Cells just
with a sense of thanks.
Wow.
I think everyone's had that experience of craving something.
And then having it
and
deeply satisfied.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whatever that thing is, whatever that food is, and that's being connected again to your body.
Sure.
And being able
to what you actually need.
And being able to listen to it and being able to trust it rather than being completely overwhelmed by intellectual data saying that you need to eat this and you need to do that and da-da-da-da. It's like, well, how do I actually feel?
How do you actually feel, yeah.
Felt the opposite.
Say again?
Well, I think we've also felt the opposite. Like
100%.
Craved something, eaten that bowl of pasta, and then just hit rock bottom. So in a way, you're describing the polar opposite of that, which everyone's had. Like, you eat the pasta, you have the bloat, and you're like, oh my God, that was the worst decision ever. Like it's a short-term gain.
Going
the other way. Which I think we more, I'm going to make a sweeping statement, we more experience that craving.
What, the negative?
The negative.
Yeah.
Than the, I eat a bowl full of greens and I'm like, oh, this is, I feel
light,
great.
And energized. And I think that's the difference. A lot of people, I don't think, realize that a meal should, I mean, it depends. Like there are times when, I think, maybe you've done an intense workout and you kind of carb load afterwards and you get that lovely hyperglycemic kind of glow and you spike your insulin and, your melatonin's coming through and it's time for bed and you get that kind of warm, fuzzy kind of recovery mode.
I think everyone's had that experience.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but also you don't want that to happen at breakfast. You don't want it to happen at lunch because when you do, most people just assume that 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock...
You slumps.
You slump, yeah. It's like your 3 slumps. So you have your coffee and you have your sugar and that's the point. 11's.
Yeah.
Cake.
If you're not learning from that, you should not feel like that.
I feel like 11's were a result of the cereal companies saying you should have cereal for breakfast, knowing, and it's like, oh, people get hungry at 11 o'clock because they've had the crash, so we'll bring out another sweet treat, probably wheat-based. That'll be quite tasty.
Another massive blood sugar spike. And that for me, in the bigger context and sort of a few years on, the biggest difference I've had from when I was eating a carb-rich, more plant-based diet was I had to eat every 4 hours.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would get this tunnel vision, and I'd like eat the leg off that chair if there's nothing else available. And
I heard that described in another way as starvation and blind panic that you're never going to eat again. So the body just
I'm
kicks
sure
into
it's a stress response. Yeah, exactly. Like massive like cortisol response or something. But when I started shifting my macros to more fat, less carbs, and I was getting my breakfast right, and I was the idea of fasting is, well, sometimes you just forget to eat, and you look around and go, it's 5 o'clock. What have I had today? Huh, nothing. Okay.
And without the adrenal
Load.
not eating.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
You can be like so adrenalized that you haven't eaten, but this is actually, it's mellow. I found that high fat diet, I'm mellow.
Yeah, you're more even.
Yeah.
And because you're not having that kind of hormone spike all the time. Yeah. And that essentially is what healed my wife from adrenal fatigue. So, yeah.
And seems to be healing most people for all of the inflammatory things that are happening.
I think that a lot of the inflammatory things are also linked to, to processed foods, to lectins, oxalates, all, we briefly, you and I talked about this off camera about, the fact that we're eating too small a variety of plants. We're eating a lot of things out of season. A lot of things are artificially ripened. A lot of things that we're eating are causing inflammation, and we're just not attuned to what that feels like. So we're not avoiding them.
I would also suggest that people just don't realise that. They don't realise that you shouldn't be eating strawberries in December in the UK.
Yeah, and also
because they've never grown up knowing that you don't get strawberries in the UK.
They're
always available.
Strawberries come in those boxes, don't they? That's where they.
That's where they grow.
They used to be green. But so again, talking about connection, like people aren't connected to their food because we have grown up in this environment or this era of like we get to choose whatever the fuck we want to eat. You go to a superstore and there's everything you can possibly imagine from all over the world.
And have you read this this book called Lights Out?
No.
Have you come across that? You both love it. It's looking at our kind of annual cycle. So if you are, as we probably are, of Northern European descent, you would have had a cycle to the year with ketosis. So in the winter, you would be basically living, because if you look outside now, there's not a lot of plants growing, and there's not a lot of things that are providing large amounts of protein and fat that you would naturally have found. So we would have lived through the winter on hunted meats, maybe a little bit of stored grain and things like that. But effectively, we were in a more fat burning keto state in the winter, and then in the summer we would have had a very small window of availability of sugars. So the people who got fat in the summer lived through the winter, and there's a combination of elevated length of daylight produces a high level of cortisol in the body. Well, if you have a massive load of glucose when your cortisol's elevated, it's a perfect storm for laying down body fat. So, but now if you think about what we're doing is we have this year-round light all the time. Electric lights, which are all the wrong colors generally, particularly with this kind of LED shift towards bluer LEDs that people insist putting in everywhere. Screens, TVs, pads, all that kind of stuff, with a year-round availability of high glycemic sugary foods, and your body thinks it's perfect storage time. It's like get fat, survive the winter. Well, we're living in permanent summer. Summer. We're never having those winters.
The endless summer. Not in a good way. It's got to come to an end.
Unless you live in Venice Beach, days.
Do you follow Mark Hyman or Dr.
A little
Mark
bit,
Hyman?
yeah.
He talks about meat being condiment, so
right?
It should be used as a condiment.
So
not mainly plants, and then always ethical butcher quality meat.
Yeah.
But mainly plants, no grains, and then oils and. It's interesting how he talks about that, how you're talking about it, how Greg Glassman at CrossFit talks about diets. They're all the same. We get hung up, like the piece you wrote for issue 1, we get hung up on the labels.
Yeah, exactly.
And that confuses, like Chris was saying, that's mass confusion through,
And I do think, I'm a believer in the fact that we are omnivores, but I think the proportions vary greatly between individuals as to what is, what makes you feel better. I've experimented with, myself with varying amounts of meat versus vegetables, where trying to kind of roughly keep the same level of calories only through satiety and knowing if I feel full and happy and my weight's not gaining or losing. And I feel best when most of my calories are coming from fats and protein, and actually I have probably fewer starches and more greens than my wife does, for example. And she does better with a little more starch and a little less fat and a little less protein. And I think it just, even from when you start thinking about this, when you develop an awareness, it takes a while to kind of work through and to learn the subtle nuances of your own diet and
that
metabolism.
changes as well.
It does,
over time.
As your hormones change and you age and the seasons. Yeah.
I think you're talking about the importance of primary research, which could be applied to every element of your life. Rather than outsourcing your decisions to someone else, you actually test out things on yourself. Don't
discount anecdotal evidence, because nobody can tell you how you feel.
Precisely. Yeah. So you get to know thyself, which we've talked about before, and you listen to yourself and you try things out, and then you kind of lock into what it is that works for you.
Yeah, and don't be stuck in a mindset of which
is an identity.
Yeah,
which is not yours anyway.
Yeah.
So again, it's the same thing of like sort of doing your primary research, of digging into yourself to find out what's actually yours and what's not. And identities aren't yours.
Yeah, and also I think it's linked into that, is I think we should all be constantly discussing the grey areas surrounding the ethics of what we're doing. Because even the most holier than thou, omnivore, vegan, whatever you identify yourself as, we have an impact. We are making an impact. Every choice we have, every breath we take, every footstep, everything we eat, everything we buy, every all the traveling we do, we have an impact. And I think we have to continually reevaluate what that impact is and not be set in. Well, we like to pigeonhole ourselves and we like to pigeonhole things because it's a form of laziness. It stops you having to think about things if you've made a global decision about a particular aspect. And I don't really want to go there too much, but it's one of the things I find really frustrating about debating with people that have decided to follow a plant-based diet is you quickly get into a very polarized position.
Well, that's been a hijacked term. Plant-based diet to me means it's plant-based. It has meat in.
I'm vegan.
A
vegan diet. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. A vegan diet, because the idea that instantly I consume no animal products, therefore I do less harm, is not always true. And I just wish that discussion could come out more, because it would lead to a lot less.
For it to be a non-emotional
discussion. Yeah, exactly.
Because then also, I keep going back to it, like if you have guilt around your decision making, then there's a bigger issue than what you're eating. So you need to understand why you have that guilt, why you're bringing emotion to the table, to be able to have a balanced discussion about it.
But do you not think we should all experience some guilt about what we do? Because that makes us.
You should understand why you're experiencing the guilt.
Right. But do you not think that we all should have? Because, like I said, I don't believe that anyone is perfect, but I think you should feel.
But what's the source of guilt? Take it back one more step. Source of guilt to me, as a reactionary thing, would be fear. And why are you making decisions based on fear?
Maybe not fear, but just maybe that nobody's perfect, and that every decision you make.
So you're just making the best decision for yourself. You shouldn't feel guilty about being in a position where you're making the best decision you can for your own survival.
At that time.
At that time, yeah.
And that decision will change over time, so you shouldn't feel guilty for it.
True. Yeah, no, I'm the same. But I think like maybe a sort of really simplistic way of looking at this is, you're out and about and your food choices are limited. It's lunchtime. You're on the high street. You know that you have ethically sourced food at home, but you still go into a sandwich bar and eat a chicken sandwich that is in the back of your mind. Doesn't matter what you tell yourself, that's not ethically sourced.
Probably just finished off with a vegan burger.
And we all do things like that. I mean, I must admit, I do a lot less of it now than I did, but there's always a degree of that in all of our lives of like making suboptimal decisions that, maybe go, it's tweaking your own.
Yeah, I think that becomes like quite a rabbit hole discussion. Because you could say, well, you knew that was going to happen, so why aren't you, I understand what you're saying.
Anecdotally for me, I used to massively rest on exhaustion and fuel on sugar hugely, and that led to adrenal burnout for me. And I know when I'm eating right, because I don't even see in stores the things that I used to gravitate towards. They're not even on the shelves. It's my experience in a supermarket is very different.
Do you find that when you're, because I've experienced that when I've kind of when my diet's super clean and I'm kind of in a cyclic ketosis thing and I'm only really carbs after I've exercised for the anabolic recovery effect, that when you walk past like a bakery, it doesn't even look like food.
Haribo's gone out of business as far as I'm concerned. It was never invented. It's extraordinary. And I'm not hungry. It's just like, I don't even like. Petrol stations are just there for fuel.
Yeah.
But I know when if I have eaten it, then you go in there and you see everything and there's overwhelm.
Yeah, those quavers are screaming at you.
Yeah. And I need the sweets and the crisps and the cake.
Salty, sweet, everything.
That's extraordinary. I know when there's a huge level of calm, which can be a very unnerving experience, because then people say, oh, are you hungry? And you're like, yeah, I'm hungry. It's 1:00, but in actual fact, I'm not hungry.
Yeah.
And really understanding that.
For me on that topic was when I started to fast, how much I realized my hunger was linked to time.
I was going to say, you were a quick faster.
If I knew I was having 24 hours without food, all of a sudden I wasn't hungry at breakfast, or I wasn't hungry at 1:00, whereas in previous days it was 1:00. Well, I need to eat lunch.
Well, the 3 times a day, it's not a biological requirement. It's a
business requirement.
Business requirement. Yeah, it's linked to our, to the way we've chosen to organize our time. It's not linked to our biology in any way.
Yeah.
And also you mentioned earlier, we were talking about the 11 and the 3:00 crash caused by kind of eating the wrong breakfast. That's something that I find quite amusing, is the birth of breakfast cereal and kind of where it came from. And
the wheat farmer.
Well, Mr. Kellogg's, who was, do you know anything about Mr.
No, but I'm assuming.
I researched Mr. Kellogg. I mean, and when you realise where breakfast cereal came from, it was essentially, he was an extreme religious Puritan who allegedly never consummated.
Were they Quakers, the Kellogg's?
I don't know. Yeah,
Quaker oats are Quakers, but
sure. But he thought that America was morally corrupt and that fornication was going against the word of God. He never consummated his own marriage, had kind of 20 adopted children. And he believed that shifting from fats and meats and, high nutrient dense food at breakfast to eating grains would quell sexual desire, stop people masturbating. And he was right. It does, because testosterone reduces. It's, your sex hormones are made from cholesterol. And he basically invented the breakfast cereal
a dogma
to reduce people's sex drive.
Wow. God, I mean.
And, ironically, decades and decades later, people still think that's the best way to start the day.
Yeah.
I mean...
And now he's got his way with obesity.
Yeah. I mean,
reverse.
The problem is, no other animal on the planet has a breakfast food.
Breakfast bar.
Breakfast food. We don't need to eat different foods at breakfast. We just
that is a huge cultural thing. I'll eat anything at breakfast. Yeah. And like when we've been in India independently, curry is breakfast. And totally cool with that.
Well, that's the origin of kedgeree as well.
Well, that was a colonial dish.
Yeah, but they're like sort of wanting kippers on toast, but then adding rice to it and turmeric, etc. to make it more. Yeah,
it's one of my favourite dishes.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. We are hitting about an hour, so being mindful of your time, I don't think that clock's right. So ignore it.
So when does Ethical Butcher launch?
We're just waiting now on packaging. Everything is ready to go. We should be up and running towards the end of January, I think.
You're going to be running by the time this comes out.
Great.
Cool. That's fantastic. Yeah. And one of the things that's holding us up at the moment is it's no good calling ourselves the ethical butcher and then vac packing all of our meats to go out in plastic that you can't recycle. Or so we've ordered this compostable plastic product, which is made from plant-based cellulose from an Israeli tech company called
they're
Tipper.
great. They're fantastic.
Israeli.
Yeah, no, that Tipper.
Tipper, you know,
yeah.
And there's
good.
some incredible tech. It seems to be coming out of Israel at the moment. But this, so Tipper will be the first, I think, people other than, I think there's a chicken farm in New Zealand who uses it. Other than that, we're the first people to use it for vac packing meat, and we've had to trial it with our vac packing machine. But the Tipper packaging that the meat arrives in will be, you can home compost it, or if it does end up in landfill, it's gone in 3 months. And not just gone, but gone into things that are actually beneficial to soil. So it's high in phosphorus.
Not soft plastic mimicking estrogen, which
exactly. Yeah. There are some petrochemical elements to it, but they've been formulated in a way that they break into harmless things. The box is aligned with cool wool, which is a waste wool material. Again, that will add nutrition to soil for anyone that's home composting. Recycled cardboard and DPD are doing our fulfillment, and we've chosen to use their carbon offset scheme for our delivery. So all of these things just took a little bit longer to get into place than if we'd have gone down a conventional route, but we're there.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Yeah, really good.
Thanks for your time and thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me and listening. Cheers, guys.